Hello, sociology students. So we are going to talk about the difference between race and ethnicity. These are the two ascribed statuses that are the focus of the social stratification chapter number 9 in our textbook, because these two ascribed statuses really greatly affect your life chances in a society like the United States. And therefore, because we know life chances affect our ability to move within our social system, then race and ethnicity can, particular race categories, particular ethnic categories can affect an individual's ability to move or have upward social mobility in a class system such as the one in the United States. Now, there are many class systems all around the world, and ascribed status can also affect your ability to move within those class systems in other places too. But of course, we're going to focus mainly on the United States because my assumption is that we know the most about this country because we've been here long enough to at least make it to the college level together. So, race and ethnicity, I hear these words used interchangeably all the time. Sometimes on forms that we're asked to fill out, I see, the word ethnic category, please identify your ethnic category, and I see some race terms in there that don't necessarily have anything to do with ethnicity. So there are some problems with just the general public's understanding of how do we use these terms. But that's why we're in this class, so we can have a better understanding of what these things actually mean. So, it's important to note in your, however you're taking notes, in your typing or if you're doing it by hand, it's important to make yourself a note that race and ethnicity, these are both ascribed statuses. So we focused a whole heck of a lot about how achieved status can affect your social stratification position, but now we're talking about ascribed. Okay, so it's important to note that race is not a biological classification. Race is something that is defined in one society in one way, and other societies might define, races differently. It's always based on physical characteristics, but the physical characteristics are so superficial that they don't have any foundation in biology, and that's why I start out by saying it's not biological. Now, there are some differences that you can measure biologically, like skin color is the physical feature, one of the main physical features that is used in the United States to identify racial groups in comparison to each other. And so there are like some scientific ways that you can measure the amount of melanin, which is the tint in our skin that gives us a light color if it's absent or a darker color if you have more. So you can measure things scientifically that way, but no, it's not anything that's so significant that one racial group based on skin color is different biologically or a different species or something than other racial groups with different levels of melanin, for instance. So we in social science recognize the fact that race is a social construction. And what this means is there's lots of different physical features that can be used in definitions of race all around the world. So I've already mentioned skin color as one of the ones that we use in the United States. Hair texture is another one that we use in the United States. Eye shape is one that is it's used sometimes for certain racial groups but not others in the United States. And around the world, when you look at different racial groups in different countries elsewhere, you'll find different physical features listed at, or important from a social standpoint in classifying people based on their race. For instance, in some countries in Africa, your skin color doesn't necessarily mean anything, but your height and your build, are you long and lean with thin, long muscles, or are you kind of short and squatty with like really powerful, stocky muscles? And so the shortness or the height and the body type, these are physical features that are observable by the eye, but scientifically and biologically, we're the same species. All of us are the same species. So race is an ascribed status because these definitions that I keep talking about, how they change from one place to the next, these definitions are part of the macro scale social structure in a place. And so you inherit these norms, these social facts, you inherit that macro scale social structure when you're born or adopted or migrate into a place. And therefore, those social definitions affect you on the micro scale, whether you want them to or not. They affect you, and you have to kind of live by them based on whatever racial category you fall into. Now, there is a movie that you might have seen about a real historic event. There was a civil war in Rwanda, which is a country in Africa. Hotel Rwanda is the name of the movie. True story. And that civil war that was happening in Rwanda, I'm mentioning it here because essentially the two groups that were fighting with each other, it was a fight over dominance, it was a fight over control, but it was essentially two racial groups, and the main focus was this racial group or tribe didn't like this racial group or tribe and wanted to control and even have a genocide to wipe them out. Genocide means killing off an entire population of people. And so the two different groups were called, one of them was called the Watutsis and one of them was called the Hutus. I don't remember which one was the dominant one, and I don't remember which physical features applied to which of those two groups, but one of those two groups, they all had what people in the United States would call black skin. People in the United States would define it that way because that's the way we define race. But in Rwanda, it wasn't defined that way. They all had the same skin tone based on a USA point of view. But from a Rwandan point of view, some were tall and skinny and long-boned, and others were short and stocky with wide noses instead of narrow noses. There were lots of physical characteristics that were used to describe these two different racial groups, and they were arbitrary physical characteristics that just that country's norms over time had come to define this set of physical features as this racial group and this other set of physical features as this other racial group. And when I say arbitrary, I mean that there are tons of different physical characteristics that we can observe that are different about each other that we could use to classify. You know, there's right-handedness and there's left-handedness. So there's an observable physical feature that we could use to classify people into different racial groups. Or my earlobes are detached from my cheek. Are yours attached? Because many people have them attached, and that could be an easily observable physical feature that we could use to classify people into different racial groups. The length of my toes is something that I don't like very much. I have short little squatty baby looking toes, and my husband has these really long toes that come out past his big toe, and I'm thinking sometimes, gosh, those toes of his and my little short Vienna sausage toes could be a reason why we could be classified as different racial groups, because it's just physical features, and any of these physical features could be defined by a society over time as meaningful to classify a person in one race as opposed to another race. So these are arbitrary physical characteristics. Just because your two other toes are longer than your big toe doesn't mean that you're a different species than the person with the short toes, for instance, or the earlobes, or the different eye color, or whatever. So race is a social construction. You have different definitions of race from one place to the next, or different classifications of physical characteristics that make up one race here and one race there. I had a student from England, from London, England, one time years ago in one of my classes when we were talking about the difference between race and ethnicity. And so we were talking about black being the appropriate term, black with a capital B being the appropriate term to refer to racial groups around the world, whereas African American is an appropriate ethnic term for black people who have a USA culture about them. We'll get to ethnicity in just a second, but she raised her hand. She had been silent the whole semester, and she raised her hand, and when she spoke, it was the first time I knew that, her British accent. I can't do accents at all, so I won't try to copy it for you, but a British accent. And so when she spoke, she had this clearly foreign accent, clearly British, and she said that when she met people here in Arkansas and began to speak to them, they were always surprised by her accent, and there would always be a question. She said, she said it never failed, that people would ask her the question that how many African Americans are there in London where she's from? And her answer was none, because African Americans are from America. They're not from Britain, right? So she's like, there's lots of black people in London, but we're not African American at all, because that's not the way race is defined there. It's not defined by ethnic behaviors or categories, like it overlaps with racial classifications here in the USA. Okay, so that's my segue to tell you that race and ethnicity are not the same thing, okay? So race, we have to look more universally, and we can apply, the definition more universally across cultures, being sure to recognize that each different society has a different definition of what physical features make up what race, or not, okay? Ethnicity, on the other hand, ethnicity is about your cultural background. It's about your heritage. It is about your cultural characteristics, your behaviors, the holidays that you observe, the food ways that you have, the religion that you practice, the language that you speak, the accent that you use when you speak a language. I referred to USA culture a minute ago, but is there a difference in a Yankee attitude, a Yankee speech pattern, a Yankee accent than a Southern speech pattern, a Southern way of life? And I say Yankee affectionately, since my mother and all her people are from Rhode Island, and so she's a Yankee in every sense of the word. So that's an ethnic distinction, because there's a different way of life, different behaviors, different accents, different words that they use even. So a friend of mine is from North Carolina, and she will say that she has to hoover her house, whereas I would say I have to vacuum my house. Right? So Hoover is a brand name of a vacuum that has become the word vacuum in North Carolina. It's very common. And so language patterns can distinguish us from one ethnic background to the next. Religious patterns can distinguish us from one ethnic background to the next. A lot of times in the United States, ethnicity and race overlap, but they aren't necessarily tied to different racial groups. For instance, there are many, many people from Honduras, for instance. My husband has a daughter who lives in Honduras and teaches at the American school there. And there are many, many, many black racial category people in Honduras, along with the racial category that I guess in the United States we would call Hispanic. Native American from Honduras, essentially. But all of them ethnically are Honduran and typically have Catholicism or some kind of evangelical Christianity as their religious background, but it's different racial groups who call themselves Honduran or Central American or Hispanic even, to use a word that's really an ethnic word, that not a racial word, that just covers all kinds of different ethnic backgrounds, because you can be Cuban, you can be Dominican, you can be all kinds of different backgrounds to be considered Hispanic in the United States. But if you are in Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, etc., any of the Central American countries, Mexican ethnicity, El Salvadorian ethnicity, Honduran ethnicity, Guatemalan ethnicity, all of these things are different, distinctively different, based on the behavioral and cultural traits that are typical of those unique places. And typically in the United States, we don't have a whole lot of knowledge about the unique cultural traits that each of those Central American countries have. So we lump everything into Hispanic community, for instance, which would be an ethnicity. And often with the idea of a certain racial or Native American classification overlapping with it. So, race and ethnicity, you can't use them interchangeably. They are not interchangeable, but they are both ascribed statuses. And in the norms and social facts that exist on the macro scale in our society, your racial classification and your ethnic classification can control, to a large extent, the life chances you have for social mobility, educational achievement, occupation type, income level, and your socioeconomic status in general. So these are vitally important concepts to understand, and we're going to talk more about how on a